Okay, so hello to everyone that's currently joining. I know a lot of you are still connecting to audio, so we'll have a bit of a slow introduction here. So just welcome. My name is Ellie. I'm one of the team at MedicMind, and I'll be leading this webinar session today on abstract reasoning. So we'll just give it a minute or two for everyone to get onto the chat. While everyone's joining the Zoom call, for those of you who are already here, it's worth getting yourselves a pen and paper or having notes out on your phone or something if you haven't already, because we will be doing some practice questions as we go through. So it means that you can write down the answers that you would have put and be able to test yourself. I won't be able to see your answers, so it's completely just for your own learning. But if you want to be tested along as we're going through, then make sure you have a pen and paper out to do so. So I'll just give it just a minute or so just for people to join into this call. It's amazing to see so many of you here today. This session is going to go from the basics of abstract reasoning. So don't worry if you've not done any UCAT prep so far, this can be a complete introduction for you. Whereas for anyone who's feeling a bit more experienced already, later on we'll have some slightly more advanced questions just to push your knowledge a little bit further. But it might be that some of you find this quite familiar content already. Okay, so I think the number of people joining is slowing down, so we will get started properly. I'll just introduce myself again for those of you who hadn't quite joined at that point. So my name is Ellie. I'm a final year student at Hull York Medical School in the UK, and I've been working with MedicMind for a couple of years now teaching UCAT. And today, as you can see, the focus is abstract reasoning. And we know that abstract reasoning is one of the sections that makes a lot of students really nervous when they first start revising for the UCAT. Because it's quite a different section, whereas things like quantitative reasoning, well, you've done maths before, verbal reasoning, many of you will have studied something similar like English literature before, but abstract reasoning is really quite different to what you use in your day-to-day. So the whole aim today is to introduce you to the types of questions you might face, to go through some warm-up questions, and to go through an acronym that we use to understand these kinds of questions. And then we'll mainly focus on going through the number type of questions, which hopefully will make more sense later. Just to let you know, we will be taking questions via Instagram. So if you've got Instagram, you can go onto the MedicMind Instagram page and you can ask questions on there. So hopefully most of what your questions will be answered anyway in the webinar. But if you've got something on your mind, something you think I've not quite explained or not quite covered, feel free to ask. I've got one of my colleagues in the background who will be sending those questions through to me during the session as well. So you're more than welcome to ask questions. Perfect. So we've got over 100 of you here. So let's kick off then. So first question is, what actually is abstract reasoning? For anyone who's not seen these questions before. So abstract reasoning is assessing your ability to identify patterns amongst abstract shapes. So that's done in a few different ways, and we'll go through the question types later on. But the key here is that a good candidate will be able to look at these shapes and find patterns between the shapes, looking for similarities, but then also an exceptional candidate will be able to avoid any distracting information that they're given. So it might be that there's certain things within those patterns that are there to distract you, and the really good candidates will be able to say, no, I'm convinced that that's not part of the pattern, and focus on what's important. And this is where actually, although this is quite a strange section in the UCAT, it is very relevant to medicine, because doctors in their day-to-day, they will be identifying patterns in diagnosis, they will be ignoring any information that doesn't seem relevant and piecing it together like a puzzle. And that is where abstract reasoning is still a relevant skill, even though it's a slightly strange question to be getting in the UCAT exam. So in terms of your timings, and timings are really important throughout the UCAT. So if you've attended the webinars the past few weeks with my colleagues, I'm sure they'll have been emphasizing how important it is to stick to your timings. Abstract reasoning is probably the tightest section for timing in terms of your time per question, because you have 55 questions to do in just 13 minutes. So 13 minutes start to finish for the abstract reasoning section. The reason why this actually isn't as difficult as it seems, though, is because actually it's 11 sets of 5 questions. So if you think of your timing per set of questions, you have just over a minute per set of 5. So we'll go through some tips later on for how to best use that 71 seconds to make sure you find your pattern and answer your 5 questions to complete that set within the time given. Because the worst thing is if you get halfway through the section and find that you're so short of time that you end up guessing answers, that would be very unfortunate. So as far as possible, you need to try and stick to just over a minute per set of questions for abstract reasoning. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but really the challenges of abstract reasoning and the reason that it is so difficult is because it's a skill that you don't often use day to day. Those of you who are coming from school or from college, this is probably not something you've done before. Practice is essential in order to recognize common patterns. So really, the more questions you're doing, whether that's official UCAT questions, whether that's through MedicMind, whether that's through other providers like Medify, the more questions you're doing, the more easy you'll find it to recognize those patterns. So we'll have tips for how to find the patterns, but really it is practice makes perfect for this section. And as I've already said, you have the least time per question compared to the other sections of the UCAT. So 13 minutes for 55 questions and about 70 seconds per set of 5. Okay. So the quick do's and don'ts in terms of abstract reasoning. So the things that are important to do. So the main thing is make sure, particularly with your type 1 questions, which are where you have a set 1 and a set 2, a set A and a set B, begin by spotting the pattern between those 2 sets before you look at your test shapes. So I'll show you some examples of this later on for anyone who's completely unfamiliar. But if you've seen the questions before where you have set A and set B, you want to spot the pattern before you answer the questions. And the reason you need to do that is because once you've found the pattern, answering the questions is incredibly quick. And if you've got a certainty in your mind as to what that rule is, it helps avoid any ambiguity when you're going through the questions. You won't be sat there thinking, it looks a bit like set A, but not quite. If you've got a clear rule in your mind, it's very easy to answer the questions. Other things to do. So look for patterns using similarities between the boxes in set A and B, and then using the pattern to answer the test shape. So that's very much linking back to the idea of spotting the pattern and imposing that limit of 1 minute per set. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but this is because it's really the crux of how you're going to approach these questions. So it's really important to stick to spotting the pattern first and sticking to just over a minute per set of questions. Things not to do, starting with the test shape. So this is where you actually, rather than looking at set A and set B, you just look at the square in the question. Don't do that. The reason not to do that is because you're then tempted to go, okay, well, that square looks a bit like set B, for example. And that is how they catch you out, because often that will not actually fit the pattern. So you need to find out what your pattern is first. Answer the test shapes based on matching them to similar looking boxes. That's another thing not to do, which links to what I was just saying, and not spending too much time on a question. So hopefully, based on everything I've said so far, none of that's too surprising. Okay, just when we're talking about this, we might talk about box 1, box 2, box 3, and so on. Generally, if I'm talking about that, box 1, I'm meaning the top left, box 2 is top right, and so on. But I'll use the mouse. Hopefully you'll be able to see that to show what I'm referring to when we go through these questions. Okay. I've not mentioned type 2 and type 3 questions yet, so we'll come back to that, but sometimes they do take longer. And again, you do need to be very careful with your timings on those as well. We'll often spend so much time on our type 1 questions, refining them, preparing them, that we forget that you also have type 2 and 3 questions where you still need to be careful with the timings. You need to start with the simplest box. Again, it'll make more sense when we go through the questions. But if you look at your simplest box first, so that might be the top left box, for example, your rule has to be present in that box. So if you find your rule in the simplest box, then that's going to be quicker than looking at a really complicated box and trying to find the rule in there. So you can actually start comparing the boxes and looking at the simplest boxes sooner. Again, it will all make more sense as we go through. I'm giving you a lot of theory at the start here, and I know it's a lot, but then it means when we go on to the questions, it will start slotting into place, hopefully. Not practicing enough, so not knowing what the possible patterns are. That's a really common mistake. Not flagging questions is another common mistake. So hopefully you'll be aware by this point. In the UCAT exam, and you'll see this if you do the official mock tests, you can click to flag questions. Flagging questions is really useful because if you're going through abstract reasoning and you don't find a pattern after your 1 minute, you might decide, actually, I will guess the answers, but I'm going to click flag. And this means when you get to the end of the section, you can go back to it and use any remaining time you have to try again, rather than spending several minutes on it the first time around. So make sure you stick to your timings, and then any time you've got left at the end, you can go back to the questions that you flagged. So do use that for abstract reasoning. And don't be too afraid to make smart guesses if you really are stuck. If you're in a situation where you said, actually, I've spent all the time I can on this question, I've come back to it at the end, I still don't know what the answer is, then try to make smart guesses. And this is where you are looking at, can I find any part of a pattern here? And just trying to appraise it on common sense. Hopefully you won't be in that situation. Hopefully you'll all know all the patterns. But in reality, we know that sometimes you might not find a pattern. Okay, so tips from the experts, and I'm aware this is a lot of me talking. I promise there will be practice questions coming, so stick with us on this, okay? So by the time you do the UCAT, you will have seen every possible question pattern at least once. If you've done enough practice questions, there shouldn't be any surprises, or there should be very, very few surprises, because you will have seen every type of question that can come up, whether it's the number of shapes in a square, whether it's having more squares than triangles, whether it's the circle being on the left-hand side of the square, whatever the patterns are, you'll have seen them before if you've done enough practice beforehand. So looking at the date now, we're coming towards the end of April. Most of you will have at least a few months before you decide to take this exam. So you've got the time to practice. And at first, you'll probably get a lot of them wrong. But over time, when you start learning these patterns, you'll get fewer and fewer wrong. And it is really satisfying to see that progress. Okay, so you will improve your speed if you're actually summarizing the possible patterns and getting used to what those are. So when you're doing your practice, there is a certain acronym called SPONKS, and SPONKS is something we're going to use throughout this session today. Each letter of SPONKS stands for a type of pattern you might see. So some of you might use other acronyms. It's fine to use another acronym, but SPONKS is one example of an acronym you can use that goes through those different patterns. And if you get used to going through and familiarizing yourself on every question you do with the different patterns that can come up, then eventually it will become second nature and you become naturally very prompted to start looking for those patterns. Okay. I'm getting a couple of questions coming through on the Zoom chat at the moment. So thank you to those people who started asking a few questions. So just to answer a couple of the questions that have already come through. So someone has asked when to start preparing for the UCAT. And someone else has asked sort of, is it too early to start if you're not taking the UCAT this year? My key point would be that actually you can start preparing as early as you like for the UCAT. So even if you're not taking the UCAT this year, if you're someone who's taking it next year, the year before, starting to prepare early just gets you familiar with question types. As long as you make sure that you are still focusing on your schoolwork, you're not letting yourself drift academically, because that's just as important as the UCAT, then I think the earlier you prepare, the better. From now, how much revision should you be doing? Well, at the moment, you've still got over 2 months until the UCAT exam, regardless of when you're going to be taking it. So if you can start just doing a few hours per week at a minimum, but then start building it up, then by the time you're taking the exam, if you're doing a few hours per day, then that should be plenty of revision. And everybody is different. So I'm not going to say strictly, you should do this number of hours per day from now, or this number of hours per week. At the moment, if you're focusing on the theory and getting used to the question types, that's great. And then in around a month's time, moving on to practice questions, then that's a really nice progression and a nice way to start preparing. Okay, and someone on Instagram has asked what I mean when I say sets of questions. So that's a really good point for those of you who've not seen these questions before. So what I mean is there will be one set of patterns with a series of questions that follow. So when I say a set, I mean a group of 5 questions that follow the same pattern, and we'll see those later on. So hopefully that will get clearer, but I apologize to anyone who was confused by that because I didn't explain that at the beginning. Something to be aware of is timing traps. So there will be some questions that are genuinely just so much harder than the others. And this isn't just in abstract reasoning, this is in all parts of the UCAT. So for those questions that are so much harder than the others, you do want to put in a guess and flag that question and come back to it at the end. I say put in a guess just in case you completely run out of time and don't come back to it, because then at least you've got a certain chance of getting that correct. But you want to try and come back to it. And coming back to it at the end means, first of all, you're not wasting your time. You've got more time to spend on the questions where realistically you're going to get an answer for it. And it also means if you have time left over at the end because you found some of the other questions easy, you've then got more chance to go through this at the end. I've seen someone in the chat has asked what Splunk stands for. If anyone wants to answer that in the chat because they know it, feel free, but I am going to go through that in a lot more depth in a moment. So don't worry if you've not heard of Splunks and you had no idea what I was talking about, because we are about to go through it. Okay. So question types. So I've mentioned to you already, there's type 1 questions, there's type 2, there's type 3, and there's type 4 questions in abstract reasoning. So we're now going to go through what each of those question types looks like. Okay, so in terms of type 1 questions, this is where you are given 2 boxes which contain different shapes. So each of those boxes will have 6 different squares within them. And one is called set A and one is called set B. And you are looking for a pattern that fits with set A and with set B. So something that is similar with set A and different with set B. And then you will be asked to choose, would a particular square fit into set A, to set B, or to neither? So this is an example of that. So I'll go through that again. So we've got set A and we've got set B. With set A, we've got 6 squares, and with set B, we've got 6 squares. So you need to look for a pattern that is present in set A and that is different in set B. And usually these kinds of patterns will mirror each other. So whatever it is you've got in set A, you will have a similar but different pattern for set B. So if everyone just takes a look at this for a moment, I'm just going to go quiet for about half a minute, just while you look at this pattern and just see if you can figure out what the rule might be with set A and set B. And after that, I will start going through it. So just have a look at set A and set B and see if you can find a pattern there. Okay, so I've given you just a little bit of time to look at that, not as long as you would actually have in the exam. So looking at set A and set B. So what you'll notice with set A is that you've got different orientations of these crosses. So you've either got them as a plus or as a cross, and the same with set B. And you'll notice there's a mixture of white and black shapes. So as a hint, the rule is something to do with both the orientation of those crosses and the colors of those shapes. For anyone who's still struggling, which to be honest, this is quite a tricky one when you've not seen this pattern before. So with set A, you'll notice that when it's a cross, it is purely white. When it's a plus, so when it's upright, there are black shapes. So a suggested rule there would be if there is a black shape present, then that causes it to be a plus rather than a cross. How does that work with set B? Well, with set B, when it's black shapes only, it's a cross. But when you have at least one white shape present there, it turns it into a plus. So the rule here would be that in set A, if you do not have any black shapes, it will be a cross. And in set B, when you do not have any white shapes, it will be a cross. So this is your hint to then go on and start answering the questions. So with these questions, you could then look at question 1 and you could say, right, well, it's a cross and it's a mixture of white and black. Well, actually, looking at both sets, in set A, when it's a cross, it's purely white. In set B, it's purely black. And as someone has just said on the chat, that suggests this is probably not fitting into either set. So be more inclined towards saying neither for question 1. Okay, so I won't go through every single question here, but hopefully you've all started to have a look at them, have a think about how you would answer them. So this is what we call a type 1 question, where you are looking for a pattern in set A and in set B, and the pattern will often be reciprocal in some way between those two sets. So those were related rules. Okay, so going through that again then. So type 1 questions were where you have set A and set B, and you're looking for a rule or pattern. Someone on the chat has just asked, could something fit into both sets? Good question. So there are cases where a particular test shape could fit into both sets, and in that case, you would select neither as the answer. So going for C, going for neither, means it either fits into neither, or it actually fits into both. So therefore you cannot say it's set A or set B. So that's a good question someone mentioned on the chat. Type 2 questions. So these are a little bit different now. So this is where you're given a series of shapes and you're asked to select the next one in the series. So this is an example of a type 2 question. So as you'll see, you've got a series of shapes here. So you're looking for what is changing as you go along the series. Now, this is quite different to the type 1 questions now. So you're going through from number 1 to number 4. What is it that's changing throughout? What is staying consistent? And then based on that, from A, B, C, and D, which one would you say is the next in the series? Okay, so again, I'll go quiet for around 30 seconds to give you all a chance to think about that. Okay, so well done to everyone who's already putting their thoughts into the chat. Feel free to disagree with each other. This is just about your thoughts. And equally, you don't have to post your answers in the chat if you don't feel comfortable with it. So going through this pattern, you'll see you start off with this 4-sided white shape. Then we're going to a 4-sided white shape with a black triangle. But then that black triangle seems to turn white and we have a new shape introduced. And then again, we've got a right angle triangle like the previous, but it's now white and a black shape has been added. So someone said in the chat, every time a new shape adds on, the color of it is black. So if we just follow that through, does that seem reasonable? Well, we've gone from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So we're adding a shape every time. So that's definitely part of the rule. Each time we add the shape, it's different to the previous. So we're keeping the previous shapes and we're adding a new one. And the new shape does always seem to be black. So that seems to hold very true. So now if we look at shapes A, B, C, and D. So first of all, we can rule out C. Why can we rule out C? Because we need to have 5 shapes. If we just had 4, we've not added anything to the sequence. So that's already ruling out C. We can rule out B as well, because there's no black shape. What we've seen is when a shape is added, it is usually black. So this now leaves us between A and D, which I think looking at the chat, those seem to be the most common answers. So well done to anyone who's ruled it down this far. How do we decide between them? Well, it seems like the shape that is introduced is the black shape. So it's the new shape. With set A, that would be keeping the diamond black. So it's less likely to be A and it's more likely to be D in this case. So well done to everyone that said D. That is the answer for this particular sequence.
Yes, I know. Shush.
Sorry, can everyone just make sure they are kept on mute for this session, just because there's so many of you in the call, just to make sure we don't end up with any feedback. Okay, type 3 questions then. So type 3, again, we're moving on to a different question type now. This is where you're given a statement involving a group of shapes and you're determining which shape completes the statement. So this isn't a written statement. This is where you've got something like this is to this as this is to this. So again, you're thinking slightly differently this time. You're thinking what has changed between the first shape and the second, and then what has changed. Well, what rule would you then use to change your next shape into its new pattern? So this one, I'm going to say, is actually quite a hard one to do, because looking at the orientation of this pentagon and how it's changed into the next one is in itself quite tricky. We've got a lot of people in the chat who are already saying they think A is the most probable answer here. So just to say, it's not going to be D, because that would not be changing to black, which is certainly part of the rule. So it is going to be one of these changes in orientation. So it's up to you in your mind to try and see how is that pentagon changing. Okay, so with this answer, you're looking at how can this triangle change to meet the orientation of this pentagon that is moving. Now, we do have a mixture of A's, B's, and C's coming through on the chat now. And I agree. I think when I've been through this question with lots of students, it is a really difficult question to follow. Now, for this one, actually A is the answer. Okay, so for anyone that's not seen it, I'll actually just give you a moment to have a look at A, have a look at the original shape, have a look at how it's changed, and see if you in your mind can come up with why actually A would be the answer as opposed to anything else. And one of your colleagues in the chat has posted very kindly some tips that might help you to get there. Okay, so I'll just give you just around 10 seconds just to have a look and try and understand why that was the answer. Okay, so well done to everyone who understood that one and was happy with that answer. And well done for chatting to each other as well as we're going through and actually helping each other understand this one. Right, so then the final one is type 4 questions. And these look a lot like set A and set B type 1 questions. But the way that you respond is slightly differently with type 4 questions. So rather than having one shape that says, would this go in set A or set B? We've now got an option of 4, and you're choosing which one fits in. So the way you approach this is actually quite similar to the type 1 questions, which is why we've left it till last to go through it, because you want to see what is the pattern in set A and what is the pattern in set B. And then based off of that, you can decide which of the following will fit into each set. So looking at these, I won't ask you to spend some time working it out necessarily. I think this is a bit more straightforward than some of the previous ones. But we've got a black circle around the outside in set A. We've got a black square around the outside in set B. On the inside, it's always a white shape. And then thinking, what are the characteristics of those white shapes? Well, actually in set A, they are purely straight-sided white shapes. In set B, there is always a curve to that shape. Not exclusively curves, just to point out, because there are some that have some straight lines like the arrow or like the semicircle at the bottom, but they have at least one curve to them. So quite a few rules going on there, but hopefully you've got the gist of what the set A looks like and the set B looks like. So based off of this, you can then go through each of those sets of shapes and decide which one goes into each. Okay, so going through those answers then, which of the following fits into set A? Well, we're looking for something that's a black circle with a white shape in between. And then when we're looking at the white shape in the middle, it's got to have purely straight sides. Well, as many of you have put in the chat, the only one that fits that criteria is D for the first one. Looking at the next one, which of the following fits into set B? So set B, it needs to have black square on the outside, and it needs to have at least one curve on the shape on the inside. Well, again, that only fits C. And then looking at the final one, which of the following fits into set B? Well, it's not going to be A or C because the color is inverted, it's the wrong way. So it's either B or D, and we're looking for one that's got at least one curve, so that will be D. So well done to everyone that said D, C, D for their answers, which I think was what was coming through on the chat there as well. So well done, everyone. That's fantastic. Okay, so These were meant to be warm-up questions, but to be honest, we've already started doing some warm-up questions. So this can be fairly quick fire. Post your answers in the chat or write it down if you're not using the chat. What is the pattern that this is showing? So what is the difference there between set A and set B? And hopefully this is a lot more straightforward than the ones you've just seen. What is the most obvious rule that you can see here? Colour, fantastic, absolutely. So you might consider if there's a secondary rule going on here. Sometimes there are secondary rules, but the most obvious thing is colour. So that's correct for the first one. How about for this second one? What's the obvious rule that you can see between set A and set B? So we've got a little bit of controversy here so far in the chat. We've got a few different ideas coming through. Okay, so generally we're getting the gist. It's to do with shapes and it's to do with color. So this is where it's really important to start testing out your ideas. So I think someone mentioned it was to do with how many black and how many white shapes. Now this is actually something that doesn't quite hold true, and I'll explain why. So looking at set A, I think set A, it's very true to say there's one black and one white shape. But if we look at set B, you don't have a consistent pattern with how many whites are black, because you've got some where there's just white, you've got some where there's multiple black and one white. So you couldn't even say, for example, there's more black than white, because that doesn't hold true for all of the squares. So that's a key point here. Whatever your pattern is, it has to hold true for all of the squares. So actually, that rule of how many black to white is not consistent. So we can say that's probably not the rule. And this is what I said was the difference between good and exceptional candidates. A good candidate can pick out, I can see some certain points here, but to take it to the next level, you then need to say, does that hold true for everything, or is it a distractor? So actually the pattern you were looking for is what someone's just posted in the chat, which was that actually for set A, you always have a black circle, and for set B, you always have a white triangle. That is your pattern that is consistent. So that is the pattern you'd be going forward with for this particular set. So that's showing there that although you can find a pattern, you really want to pick apart, is it the pattern that's actually going to help you get the answers, or was it a distractor? So the key here was that it was a black circle in set A and a white triangle in set B, which is a combination of shape and color, which the majority of you were getting that it was something to do with shape and color. So some things to bear in mind, and some of this is just reiterating what I've already said. So the pattern in set A will often be the inverse of the pattern in set B and vice versa. So if you find a pattern in one, look for whether there's going to be one in the other. Okay, for example, if set A has an even number of shapes per box, set B might have an odd number of shapes. I know someone's just asked in the chat about if there was going to be a poll. There was originally going to be a poll for those questions I just went through quite quickly, but I think you were getting the answers so swiftly there that we're not going to do a poll for that one actually. But just keep writing down your answers, keep contributing in the chat, and we're going to have more questions as we go through. Because each set has 6 boxes, the pattern in a set must apply to every single box. So that was what we were coming back to with that previous pattern. We had the idea, could there be more black shapes than white, or a certain number of black shapes to white? But if it doesn't stand true for all 6 squares, it cannot be the rule. And you need to be quite ruthless in eliminating rules that don't work. And that's, again, it takes practice. You've got to be quite confident in saying, I thought I found a rule, but I was wrong. That isn't the rule. And moving on to finding a different rule, which is quite hard in itself. Typically, when we find a rule, we tend to get a bit fixated on it. And you need to be able to put it to one side and say, no, I'm going to look for a different rule now. Okay, so an example of a type 1 question. We've looked at a few examples already, but this is a type 1 question looking at a slightly different rule. So can anyone post in the chat what they think the rule is for this particular question? What can you notice is the difference between set A and set B? So we've got a few ideas coming through, but I'll just give you a little bit longer to see if anyone disagrees or if everyone agrees. And if you think you found the pattern, just try out if there's any other patterns going on. There might not be, or there might be. So just see if there's anything else there. Good. So I think we've got pretty much a consensus there in the chat. So in set A, there are an even number of shapes, and in set B, there's an odd number of shapes. I mentioned there, if you found the pattern quite quickly, it's worth always looking if there's a second one, because it might be something like they are always even in set A, and there is always a triangle or something like that. So always just look out for if there's a secondary rule going on. But the core rule here is that there's always an even number of shapes in set A and an odd number in set B. And it's particularly these number type of questions that we'll be going through more today. Okay, and we've already mentioned the answer will be C if it neither fits into A or B, or it fits into both. So in terms of your technique, so this is the Medic Mind method for approaching these questions. First of all, ignore the test boxes. What do I mean by that? I mean the little squares where it's saying, is this in set A, set B, or neither? Ignore that until you found the pattern, because if you don't find the pattern, there is no point looking at the questions. So find the pattern first. Look at the simplest box in set A and compare with either another box in set A or a box in set B. So if we have a look back at that one that we just did, so the simplest box in set A, you could say, well, it's probably the bottom left. That's quite a simple square. So looking at that, I can say, well, there's two diamonds. One is black and one is white, and it's an even number. So you've got a few possible rules there. If I then look at another square in set A, oh, there's two again, so that's an even number. They're not the same shape this time. Again, one is white and one is black. So you're reiterating, is this the rule? Is this not a rule? And as you start going through, you can then start ruling things in and out. So then when we compare to the top right of set A, we go, well, it can't be that half of them are black or half are white, because that doesn't work anymore. It can't be that it's two shapes, because that doesn't work anymore. And then eventually you'll get to the idea that it must be an even number. For this, you didn't need to go into that level of depth, because for a lot of you, it was quite a straightforward rule. But in some questions where you really struggle, breaking it down and looking at the simplest squares can be really helpful. Or if you don't want to compare two squares in set A, you could take the simplest square in set A and compare it with the simplest square in set B and say, well, what's different between these two? And some of you might prefer to use that technique. You can identify the pattern using SPONKs. This question keeps coming out in the chat, so I will go through it now. So SPONK stands for shape, position, orientation, number, color, and size. These are the types of patterns that can come up. And then once you've found your pattern, confirm it works in all the boxes and answer the questions. Okay, so I've already explained this, so I'll just move on slightly. Okay, so in terms of looking for set A and set B, look for their similarities and look for their differences. That would be the key point here. So if we're comparing two set A boxes, for example, these two, you could say they both have a black shape and a white shape, they both have two shapes, and they both have straight-sided shapes. So that's an example of how you can look at two squares to start picking out rules that are common throughout. And then you can start comparing them to more, as I was just suggesting there, and you'd find that the only thing that was consistent was that there are an even number of shapes. Whereas if you compared set A against set B, then you're saying, oh, well, in set A, there's one black and one white, but in set B, there's just black. In set A, there's two shapes. In set B, there's one. So you're trying to come up with something that's different. And that's another technique that you may wish to use. And we're going through lots of techniques today. So the important thing is to go away and practice these techniques on your own to see which techniques actually work for you personally. Right. So I mentioned SPONKs very quickly there. Many of you on the chat have mentioned it. So we'll now go through it in more detail. Okay, someone's just asked, isn't SPONKs time consuming, or rather referring to the previous techniques? Bear in mind, if you spot the pattern straight away, you don't need to use these extra techniques. These techniques are your foundation for if you're struggling to find things. So for example, using SPONKs, you're not going to apply this to every single question because that would take far too much time. But you would look and you would say, well, this seems like it could be a color pattern. What kinds of color patterns do I know? And if that turns out not to be true and you're struggling, then you can go back and say, right, could it be to do with shape? No, it couldn't. Could it be position? No, it couldn't. Orientation? Oh, that works. So you get quite quick at filtering through and using this as a backup technique, which is why it takes a lot of practice to get used to. So for anyone who didn't get what Splunk was before, so it's shape, position, orientation, number, color, and size. So for shape, that's things like, is there a triangle in every box? Is it symmetrical versus asymmetrical? So is there always a line of symmetry or multiple lines? Are the shapes always curved or always straight or always at least one curve? Are they concave versus convex shapes? And if you don't know what that means, I suggest just Googling concave and convex shapes and having a look. That's quite a rare pattern to come up. Right angles, acute angles, if we're looking at triangles particularly, and just generally looking at the types of shapes that you've got. So it can be more than just saying triangles, it could be the type of triangle. It could be, are they regular or irregular shapes? So is it things like squares, pentagons, hexagons, or is it things like arrows and lightning bolts? Because those are quite different. So start looking at the types of shapes that you've got. Okay, so then looking at position. So the position is really about where are these shapes? And that can be where are they in the box or where are they in relation to each other? So an example of that would be when you've got lots of shapes in the box, but the key is that actually the square is always to the right-hand side of the triangle. And these are patterns that you have to kind of see in practice to really get them in your mind. But it's looking at how the shapes have been arranged, or have they been rotated? Or is it something like there's always more shapes on the right-hand side of the box than the left? So you're getting used to different kinds of positional patterns. And these are the ones that often catch candidates out a lot because we just don't look for them as regularly, which is why Splunk is again useful, because it reminds you to have a look at that if you haven't already. Okay, so then we're moving on a bit more. I think we've switched back to number there. So there we go. Orientation. Orientation is about, are things pointing in certain directions? So this is, if you're looking at triangles, if you're looking at arrows, are they pointing to the right? Are they pointing upwards? Are they pointing at other shapes? So it might be that you've got a triangle that always points to a black shape, for example. So it's not just orientation on its own there, but how does that relate to other shapes? Then number, so we've covered number a little bit already. So is it that you've got a certain number of shapes in the box, so you always have 5 shapes? Is it odd versus even? Or is it something a little bit more complicated? So it could be the number of sides of shapes in total. That can take a very long time, so you would leave it until you're sure there's nothing else going on. Is it that you've got shapes that are overlapping? So say if they're not shaded in and they're overlapping and you're looking at the intersections between them. So how many times do the lines cross or how many areas are created? So that's other types of number patterns that can come up. Then we've got color. So tips that you might be looking at color would be if you've got gray shapes involved because they're not very common, or if you've got spotted or striped shapes, that might be a hint. Or it can just be you've got black and white shapes and you notice a relationship between them. So always twice as many black shapes as white. Or does it relate back to the shapes again? So always a black triangle, for example. So those are some color patterns, and those tend to be some of the easier ones to spot. And then size. Now, size can sometimes be a distractor, but it is things like the biggest shape is always a certain thing, or the biggest shape is always in a certain place. So look for shape as well as another possibility. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of possible patterns, and we've just been through a huge number of rules. It is only as you start practicing and start seeing these rules that they will start sticking in your minds more. But if you're right at the start of your revision, you can make a list of patterns, make a list of things that you've just heard can come up, that you might have seen elsewhere, that you might have seen on YouTube videos. Go through those patterns and get familiar with them so that when they start coming up, you can see them. So there are some certain triggers that you might look for. So as we've said, you don't want to just go mindlessly through Splunks for everything. It takes far too much time, but you want to look for triggers and then start at whichever part of Splunk seems most relevant to you. So for example, if you saw a crescent moons aren't very common. So that might make you think, is this to do with curved shapes? Because we know crescent moons have curves. So that's one trigger that you might look for, which would prompt you to look at shape first. Or if you've got a box like this with lots of shapes within it, I'm already thinking, is this position related? Because it could be that you've got, say, the circle above the triangle or the triangle above the circle. So you're looking at the position of the shapes. And with one like this, where you've got so many shapes, that's quite likely. Someone just asked in the chat, if we're writing a list of patterns, what do we write? So what I mean is you can write yourself a bullet point list that says things like odd versus even, curved versus straight, symmetrical versus asymmetrical. And if you write yourself a big long list like that, then it starts to give you an idea of the things you're looking for. You wouldn't use that in the actual exam. This is more for your practice while you're getting used to it. And then eventually you won't need the list because you're so used to it. And I say that because so many people struggle at the beginning with knowing what to look for. In terms of orientation, so again, if you've got triangles, if you've got arrows, those are your hints to look at orientation. And also clocks. So I won't touch on clocks very much, but they are questions that sometimes come up. The key with clocks is you're not reading the time. You are looking at the angles between the hands. And the commonest mistake that people will make is they just go, okay, well, those hands, they're quite close together. So that's probably about 45 degrees there. And they just leave it at that. You need to know which way you're reading the angle. Are you reading from the hour hand to the minute hand or the minute hand to the hour hand? And whatever you do, be consistent. So if you've decided that this is, say, 45 degrees going from the minute hand to the hour hand, that's fine. But when you look at the other shapes, go from the minute hand to the hour hand again, so that you are consistently looking at the same thing with the pattern. And that's the biggest mistake that people make with clocks. But that's another type of orientation question. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to go through that one particularly today. So with number, it's not worth spending your time counting in every single question. But if you look at it and you're looking at the simplest squares and you're going, well, actually, number seems to be quite important here, that's your prompt to start counting. And similarly, thinking of number of sides is not a very common thing that comes up. So if you're struggling for other things, then looking at number of sides is one possibility. I've already mentioned color. If you've got gray shapes, that's a hint. If you've got particularly small and particularly large shapes, you might look at size. So we're starting at different parts of Splunks depending on what the triggers in the shapes are telling us. So we're now going to specifically look at number patterns. So that's the only one we're really going to go into today because we've only got about 20-25 minutes left. So we're going to focus in on number. But then when you're on your own, you can start looking at the other types of patterns. So whether you've got lessons but with Medic Mind, whether you're going through things like Medify, whether you're using books, whatever it is that you're doing, you can start looking at those other types, but we'll just go through number today. So I've already talked a bit about the types of number questions that can come up. So things like if you've got two triangles in every box, or if set A always has an even number of sides, things like that. So things related to number. Okay. So when we're looking at the shapes, you want to consider either the quantity or the characteristic of those shapes. So with number, we're looking at the quantity quite a lot because hence it's number. But it might be that you're looking for a quantity of a certain characteristic. So how many right angles there are, for example. So thinking of number very rarely comes on its own. It will often visit alongside a characteristic of those shapes. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I think at this point we're being a bit repetitive with what we're going through. So I will skip ahead just slightly so that we can do these practice questions. So first of all, so here's a practice question, and I'm going to go quiet just to allow you an opportunity to have a look at this question and think about what the pattern is. So I'm going to go quiet for about 40 seconds now to let you have a look at this one. Okay, so I've just given you 40 seconds there. So that is, in reality, you want to spend probably about 50 of your 71 seconds looking for the pattern. So it's slightly shorter than you might use in the exam. So looking at this, you're trying to find something that is consistent. Now, somebody in the chat has mentioned a very good point for learning here, which is they've said that set A always contains a white square. And someone else has replied and said, well, actually, set B also always contains a white square. So this is where they found a rule, but you can test it. So yes, in set A, there is always a white square, but there's also always a white square in set B. So that can't be the rule for this particular one. So everything that's coming up in the chat seems to be relating to white squares, white circles. My question would be, have you considered anything like the number of shapes, the number of sides, the number of certain shapes that you've got? So for example, how many squares do you have? How many triangles do you have? So someone has just actually posted a rule very similar to that. So saying set A is, you've got double the number of squares compared to triangles in set A. So let's have a look if that holds true. So in this top left square, you've got 4 squares and 2 triangles. Okay, double the squares to triangles. Looking at the next one, 2 squares, 1 triangle. That works, double the squares to triangles. Looking at the next one, 2 squares, 1 triangle. That works again, so that's holding true. And then they've said set B squares is double circles. Okay, so we've got 2 squares and 1 circle in this one. We've got 4 squares and 2 circles in this one. Already that is holding true. So fantastic to the person who got that rule in the chat, because that was a really tricky one. And everyone was getting the idea. It was something linked to the squares and circles. So it's just them pinning it down and trying to come up with a really consistent one. Okay, so the rule there was to do with the number of squares and triangles and squares in circles. Okay. So now looking at another set of questions here. So again, I'll go quiet for around 40 seconds just to let you have a chance to try and answer this one. And remember, if you find a rule in set A, try and find a reciprocal rule in set B if you can. Okay, so that is your 40 seconds. Again, in the exam, you want to give yourself 40 to 50 seconds to look at these patterns. And then once you've got your pattern, move on and answer the questions. So I can see from the chat that most people are saying it's something to do with the intersections. So when you have these non-shaded shapes that are overlapping, one of the key things you are looking at is either intersection, so how many times the lines cross, or the number of areas created by them crossing. So looking at this top left one, I'd say, well, it crosses twice and it creates 3 areas. So it's going to be to do with something like that if you've not found the pattern already. Now, what everyone is correctly saying is it's something to do with the number of intersections. So if we start looking through these, what you'll find is, so you've got 2 intersections in this first one. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intersections in the next one. 1, 2 intersections in the next one. So you're going through counting them. Compare that to set B. Got 1 intersection, 1 intersection, 1 intersection, 3 intersections. This is already sounding like odd versus even, which is exactly what many of you have said in the chat. So set A has an even number of intersections and set B has an odd number of intersections. For anyone who's struggling with this, I know I'm moving through very quickly just because we have limited time today. These sessions are recorded, so you can actually go back through and have a look again if this is going a bit quicker than you're ready for, and that's absolutely fine. You've got months yet until the exam. So make sure you don't count for every single question, but in these questions, there were some obvious triggers for why you wanted to look at number. And we've already mentioned intersections or regions created are common patterns as well. Right, so we've got just 5 minutes left here. So we're going to try and go through as many questions as we can here in the time remaining. So you'll see a poll has come up for this question. So the key is, before you answer the question, so I know someone's answered already, look for the pattern first. Spend your first 40 seconds or so looking for the pattern before you answer if you can, okay? This is not about who gets it the quickest. This is about who's getting it right. So make sure you look for the pattern, then look for your answer. And I'm going to give you until the poll reaches 50 seconds to try and find your answer. Okay, so the poll has reached 50 seconds. So anyone who's not committed to an answer, put your answer in now. So most people seem to be saying A, although there is some disparity there with people saying B and C. So we're looking for what the rules are here. So looking at set A, if I look at the simplest square in set A, so probably looking at the top left of set A, we can see that there's 3 shapes in the top left of set A, a mixture of white and black, and a mixture of shapes. If I look at another simple shape in set A, I can see the one below also has 3 shapes, also a mixture of white and black, and also a mixture of shapes. So far, the consistent thing is that there's 3 shapes. Looking at the one below, that's now 7. Okay, so odd shapes is holding true in set A. Look over at set B. Okay, we've got 2, we've got 4, we've got 4, we've got 4. Right, odd and even seems to be holding true here. So for A, those are odd shapes, and for B, that's for even shapes. So where would we put this one? Well, this is odd, so I'm going to put that with set A. So that's how this will work. Okay, so we've gone through that one. I won't particularly do the follow-up questions for this one because it was more about finding the pattern, and we'll move to the next set so that you can look at another pattern. Okay, so I believe we're going to have another poll for this one. And again, I'll give you 50 seconds here to try and find the pattern and then put in your answer. Again, it's not about who's the quickest. If you think you found it that quickly, great. But it's not about who's the quickest. It's about finding the pattern and then answering the question. So take your time, have a look through, try and figure out what's going on in set A and in set B. Okay, so everyone's seeming a bit more confident with this one already. For anyone who's not put an answer, put your answer in the next few seconds. Fantastic. Okay, so we'll end that one there. So that was very clearly set A from what everyone was answering. So the question is, what actually was the rule? So naturally, we're looking at white and black circles. So this can't be to do with shape because they're all circles. It can't be to do with the total number because they've all got the same total number. So it's either going to be the position of the black shapes, potentially, or how many black shapes there are compared to white. That's really narrowing it down what we could be looking at. So I believe someone has already put the correct answer in the chat. So I'm just going to close this a moment and we'll just flick through to the answer there. So members of both sets contain 25 circles, but in set A, there's 9 black and 16 white dots, whereas set B, it's 10 black and 15 white dots. Okay, so we have reached the 1 hour for this session. So I think we'll have to leave it there in terms of practice questions. But I just want to really reiterate the things that we've gone through today, okay? So for everyone who's come along today, think to yourselves, what are the main things you can take away from this? So I've just got a couple more questions to answer before I summarize here. So someone has asked, for students in Australia who've got UCAT coming up in July, and actually in the UK, some people have their UCAT as early as July as well. How can you start preparing from today? From today, I would say, have a look at the Medic Mind YouTube channel. Start looking at the theory behind some of the UCAT questions. Start understanding what kinds of things commonly come up in the UCAT. How do you approach these questions? Because it's all very well going straight to practice questions, but if you don't understand the theory behind it, it's very hard to actually answer the questions. So work on your theory first, and in around 1 month's time, start doing as many practice questions as you possibly can. See as many things that come up as possible. So someone has asked a question on the Instagram. What's the ratio of easy to hard questions in the UCAT? Great question. Very difficult to answer though. So in terms of easy to hard questions, I would say that UCAT does tend to be a very difficult exam. When you're building up, obviously the questions you get right will be the easier ones initially, but it is about just how you build up your skills to answer the harder questions. What you'll find is that everyone gets slightly different questions coming up in the UCAT because it's from a question bank. But what they try to do is standardize it so everyone's got a similar level of difficulty in the exam. So it will be a mixture of easier and harder questions. If it's a really, really hard question, then do flag it and come back to it at the end. But in general, just do the best that you possibly can and try not to overthink ratio of easy to hard questions. So just to summarize what we've been through today, we've talked about abstract reasoning. Abstract reasoning is where you're looking for patterns, and there's 4 key types of questions. Practice all of them, get used to all of them. We focused on the type 1 questions today. Within that, you can use Splunk, which is an acronym to help you look at different types of patterns. You don't need to use it on every question though. It's just to help your memory and start looking at those types of patterns. Practice as much as you possibly can to get used to different types of patterns. And as you'll have seen with number, so there's lots of ways that these rules can intersect. So we've looked at number, but that's also applied to color. It applies to shapes. So the abstract reasoning section is all about getting in that extra practice. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much to everyone that's come along. Thank you to everyone who's been answering the poll, contributing in the chat. Well done for answering each other's questions as well. That's really helpful. And thank you to everyone who's also asked questions on Instagram as well. Hopefully you'll have realized this is part of a series of webinars. So my colleagues will be presenting other webinars in the coming weeks as well. So hopefully you found this one useful, and we'll see you again at future webinars. So take care everyone, and good luck in your upcoming exam.